What a pleasure to be here again in Krakow. It's actually been several times, but here in the midst of, in the Ignatianum, I like to think of this really as a bastion holding out with theological thinking, even in a very secular age. I think you maybe hear already in my title the echo of Martin Heidegger's essay about 1954, I believe. Die Frage nach die Technik, the question concerning technology. Heidegger, having lived through the revolutionary technological upheavals of the 20th century, from electricity to aviation to the unprecedented power unleashed through nuclear fission, presciently interpreted the ways that technology imposes on human existence and poses existential threats to human being there, Dasein. There's a French version of his warnings that was developed by, in a more sociological register, by Jagiellonian. And both authors, Heidegger and Ellul, have a strong sense of a religious, or at least of a mysterious dimension of being as transcending human comprehension and manipulation into this realm of the unsayable that Martha just mentioned. The problem with technology, or more exactly with the essence of technology, das Wesen der Technik, which is not itself technological, but a human form of thought corresponding to historical destiny, as Heidegger insists, is it's making the self-reflective subject sovereign as the Archimedean point for all knowledge and relation to the world and to others. Heidegger, in contrast, disclosed existence as prior to the worlds or orderings of existence created self-reflexively by subjective consciousness. Worlds are grounded in something else. Heidegger calls this the earth, die Erde, and which in the course of time reabsorbs our humanly invented orderings of things into a world. The earth takes our worlds back into its own chaotic bosom, destroying them the way all human material artifacts decay with the passage of sufficient time. So what I'm proposing here is to try to think the essence of technology, right? Das Wesen der Technik. I'm not going to be too technical, but really to try to think what are the grounds in our human existence for the technological apocalypse which has taken over, really, and is accelerating at rather alarming rates in our contemporary world. I mention these Heideggerian references since Heidegger is no longer necessarily the atmosphere that we breathe in philosophical symposia, especially since the attacks on him for his political debacles. He's not even on the bibliography that was circulated for this conference. There are other sources among Heidegger's predecessors and heirs, such as Husserl or Hans Jonas, for some of the ideas he expounded with matchless force and lucidity. However, certainly Heidegger was the central reference for the critique of technology for several generations of continental philosophers up to the present millennium. Central to this critique, in its many forms, is the insight and imperative that we need to avoid the obsessive focus on technology that enables it to dominate our lives and thought. Technology, or the thinking dominated by it, reduces everything to objects. Ultimately, with the information technology that is currently revolutionizing the modern or postmodern world, everything is dissolved into digital combinations of 0 and 1. What an obsessive focus on technology eclipses is an unobjectifiable dimension of existence that I've treated as apophasis. That's the more technical word for the unsayable. Apophasis, away from speech. It's the Greek word simply for negation. Plato and Aristotle use it commonly to mean negation. So it's negative theology or apophatic theology are the same thing, though one can nuance those terms. So I've treated this unobjectifiable dimension of existence as apophasis from numerous angles of observation. The unsayable is the root of what I consider to be the truest or least self-deceived religion based on negative theology as opening to a dimension of what is wholly other than the human and worldly. When I say negative theology, we're simply calling to mind the fact that all of our discourse about God is inadequate. God is the transcendent. So whatever we say, all of our concepts are not God. Theology is negative by its very nature. This mystical dimension is the source of beauty and ethics beyond the scope of all that is objectively the case, as Wittgenstein clairvoyantly realized already in his Tractatus. And he does use das Mystische. Heidegger doesn't like to talk about the mystical. For him, das Geheimnis is really the enigmatic. That would be his preferred vocabulary. But in terms of negative theology, it opens that space of the open that is then, I think, interpreted by theology. It can be interpreted in myriad ways. Theology is certainly one of the most sophisticated and illuminating vocabularies for trying to relate to that ungraspable dimension that is the root of religion. Everything in our techno-scientifically dominated culture teaches us to focus on some definable content as object in order to manage and control it according to our subjective desires and intentions. Such a cultural bias ushers in the technological apocalypse that closes us off from the unfocused, holistic awareness of life. This reifying consciousness existentially threatens our well-being and serenity as parts of a greater whole that we cannot objectify positively and can only forget or relate to by recollective forms of remembrance. Erased or forgotten in the technological mindset is what Heidegger called being, right, as opposed to beings, Daseinende. He analyzed its eclipse as resulting from metaphysics and science, or more specifically in framing, Gestell, within the world picture of the self-conscious subject. Right? Die Zeitalter des Weltbildes is the reference there. The technological mindset places us in the position of a subject for whom everything else around it is an object to be managed and manipulated. This can create a false and unhealthy relationship with the various sorts of others in the world. It can become a kind of autism. Everything is reductively filtered by our own self-relation. You know, modern philosophy, je pense donc, je suis. There's that self-reference really at the root of any possible knowledge. The apparent connectedness of all through social media is in fact a loss of any authentic contact with others. It turns us all into autonomous users, indifferent to any real consequences for others, since the connection is actually a separation through the web that makes all interactions virtual and devoid of responsibility. However, there is another possibility arising from the universalization of self-relation into a prism for every type of relation with others. For this possibility, I turn especially to the Middle Ages. Self-reflexivity is the hallmark of modernity, but it has its origins in the Middle Ages and determines the decisive turn to modernity and its technological apocalypses. Self-reflexivity becomes purely pragmatic in the modern era, but it was once a matter primarily of seeing and acknowledging the truths of being and of God. Self-reflexivity was enjoined by the imperative of wisdom after the motto, know thyself, genothi se auton, engraved on the gateway to the oracle of Apollo at Delphi. Truth is all important in the sense of truth to self and truth to God. Truth cannot be separated from morality or religion in a medieval understanding. Truth in Heidegger's and Greek philosophy's sense, too, depends on more than propositions corresponding to facts. It occurs prior to any perception or reflection on the part of subjects. For Heidegger, the self-disclosure of being as aletheia was the first moment prerequisite to any possible ascertaining or experience of the true, any verification of propositions. Our modern secular culture has shallowed out and narrowed down the conception of truth to something we grasp rather than something we strive to conform to. In the typical medieval view, we do not possess truth. It possesses us if we live in the truth. We live our relation to the other that gives us our being, whether this other is conceived of as being or as God, or as the others with whom we live together socially and become what we are, who we are. I take this to be a lesson of medieval and ancient culture that informs Heidegger's sense of the self-revealment of being as having the initiative in history. His injunction to us to listen or hearken to being was a revival of this characteristically medieval attitude. I believe Heidegger's formation in the scholastic philosophy of Aquinas and Scotus, for whom infinite being is God, prepared him to think this way. This sort of critically humanistic, or rather ultra-humanistic perspective encompasses a vocation to resist takeover by technology and AI, artificial intelligence. Is resisting this takeover impossible? There's perhaps something, or utopian, there is perhaps something in the Heideggerian critique of technology that resembles Don Quixote fighting windmills as an emblem of the Industrial Revolution in early modern times. We need not become technophobic, but we have to make room for a dimension of the open and the infinite in our applications of technology. We are all directly familiar with innumerable ways in which technology risks dehumanizing and mechanizing our lives. In the age of the explosion of AI, we're becoming aware now more than ever of how technological takeover can indeed threaten our existence. We must open our concepts of mutually exclusive identities towards their infinite truth, rooted in our unlimited interconnectedness as humans sharing in a being that reaches beyond us and is found also in all other beings. In opening our ideas beyond their finite content, we open ourselves to building a world together. That is, when we reason, we use defined concepts inevitably, but those definitions are always valid up to a certain point. When we define ourselves as Poles or Americans or Europeans, Russians, just to use those national concepts, but any of these concepts are fictions, really. None of us, we're so much more than any of those concepts can express. And somehow we have to reconnect with those roots that are really inconceivable, inarticulable, in order to overcome the kinds of conflicts that are riving our world asunder. We are all interconnected. The information age is also a great opportunity to realize this interconnectedness in some unprecedented ways. I don't want to oppose it. I do not say that technology is bad any more than I would say generically that religion is good, ignoring the ways in which it can be turned into a demonic, destructive force. The classic solution to absorption in an objective world is self-reflection, turning one's gaze inward on oneself and becoming aware of one's limits, signally death, memento mortis. Without self-reflective awareness, we are like Narcissus, in love with images that we do not even recognize as reflections of our own self. That was the second image there is Caravaggio's Narcissus. Nothing can be appreciated as truly other if we are absorbed in a purely objective mode of seeing. We see everything as finite, particular entities before us because we do not see ourselves and our own infinite implication in creating this world picture. Our own inextricable involvement is blended out. And then we have this dichotomy, subject and object, which is really artificial. The common key to technological power and to human adherence to the truth alike is self-reflection. This is our quintessentially human capacity, and at the same time, the root of our technologies. Technology of all sorts, but most evidently information technology, empowers itself by multiplying circuits of self-reflection, 0, 1, repeated ad infinitum. I propose to contemplate the question concerning technology from the perspective of this mechanism of self-reflexivity, but also to apprehend the potential of self-reflection as the paradigmatically free act of human spirit or intellect. So I'm proposing to contemplate now the essence of technology as self-reflection, really. But also self-reflection is the essence of human freedom. The two go together. Somehow we have to find where they are still united if our technology is not going to dehumanize us. And at the end I'm going to think, is it then an instrument? This is, but usually we fall into this idea that, well, we have to, master technology, use it. I actually, there's an important nuance. I don't want to go quite that route. So that was really a prolegomena now to a conceptual genealogy of self-reflection. Self-reflection is the means by which the individual subject first brings itself into being. Subjectivity is constituted by the capacity of consciousness to reflect upon itself and grasp itself as an immanent realm of self-awareness and autonomous activity. Power is gained over others and over one's environment by not reacting directly and immediately in response to them. In such immediate bilateral relations, the human subject is likely to be overpowered by the forces of nature and is, as often as not, outmatched even by members of its own species. Instead of directly opposing superior force in chaotic fashion, we can leverage power by constructing a self-enclosed system or grid that we ourselves mold and control. By managing some such construct that we master, and by extending it gradually, we can build on the modest powers that we possess by nature and can enhance their scope. By managing the advance of civilization has augmented the wherewithal of power constructed in this manner almost beyond imagining. At the most basic level, this repetitive self-reflective mechanism might be illustrated simply by the building of a wall, stone by stone. It's possible to erect an impregnable bulwark in which each piece is chosen and shaped and then integrated with the others in an interlocking network by repeatedly applying the same methods to the same type of basic materials. In one of the most primitive forms imaginable, such a construction embodies the principle of simple repetition of the same. It demonstrates the practical power of mechanical self-reflexivity. It's a circuit. Modern technology has proved capable of expanding such deliberately self-reflexively generated power on a fabulous scale. In laser technology, for instance, a series of mirrors is used to reflect again and again the same beam of light, and thus to multiply it exponentially in intensity. Almost any system of circuitry in our myriad devices operates on an analogous principle of endless reduplication. These mechanisms work almost like magic in creating internally coherent programs that efficaciously act upon external reality simply by regulating, through repeating patterns, their own internal circulation of information. By turning inward and relating directly only to itself, the self's, or original cell's, initial power can be gathered and multiplied deliberately and artificially. Through such methods of self-replication, the self is enabled then to relate indirectly to the outer world with redoubled force. This type of power can be multiplied without limit to produce comprehensive systems with virtually uncontainable potential to further extend the reach of our command. There's a kind of cunning of reason, right? Hegel's List der Vernunft, in not attempting to match force by force, not confronting nature and others directly, but rather withdrawing into a sphere that one can construct and control for oneself. Through such methods, we can attempt then to deal on our own terms with the reality that lies outside the calculable, manageable circuits that we create. We create a system for ourselves through which we can define and dominate a realm of our own making and shaping. Actually, what we control is not the world as such in its intrinsic reality, but only the forms of it that we recognize and construe in our conceptually constructed system. We substitute a humanly concocted model for nature itself in the unsoundable depths of its own being. In its intrinsic reality and alterity, the real remains for us a closed book. The entire technological apparatus of modern civilization that spans and harnesses the earth, garnering its resources for human use, is made possible and is brought into being in this manner through self-reflection. Self-reflection is a source of power that is quite different from the immediate raw power of nature. A different kind and order of force is created by self-reflection and its formalizations. This force is no longer immediate like that of the weight of a stone or the violence of the wind. It is of a different order from the might of an approaching tidal wave or the destructive burning consumption of a forest fire. The uncanny self-engendered force of self-reflection is realized through renunciation of first-order force, as Adorno and Horkheimer so effectively argued and illustrated through their reference to the archetype of Odysseus. Now, this new type of human hero is distinguished by using technical devices and craft to worst his enemies and to triumph over superior natural violence, exemplarily in the shape of the Cyclops. The specifically human power of self-reflection is based on self-denial and subjection of life with its instincts and impulses to a rule of law and order. All civilized order is founded on such application of force against oneself. This is the thesis of die Dialektik der Aufklärung. Odysseus is examined in detail from the Homeric sources and is made to stand out as a first archetype of bourgeois self-mastery for the sake of achieving domination over others and over nature. The source of his exemplary and formidable empowerment is in effect, at its roots, the power of self-reflection, a critical thinking and conscious calculation manifest in self-restraint. This is right, the figure of Odysseus as expounded by Adorno and Horkheimer. Humanity gains power in this indirect, sometimes devious way by withdrawing from direct engagement with external reality and instead self-reflectively defining for itself a world of immanence made up of formalized objects that are abstract and exist only in the world created by human spirit and for human consciousness. This has been the recipe for technological progress and the magic formula for gradually achieving sovereignty over nature. Now, I do want to be clear that what's dominated is not really nature itself, but only a formalized schema, an abstract version or model of it. We can destroy nature as we understand it, but the chemical substance is all still there on its own terms, and it's not the least deranged, right? Nature is always obeying only its own sovereign dictates. And what we call mastering nature is really only making arrangements for ourselves right within the compass of its own unrepealable laws, right? The question now is, can we ignore nature's own sovereign dictates, or can we enter into a more intimate, interactive relation with nature by our self-reflective constructions? And on this question, really, our fate hangs in the balance. Self-reflection emerges in modern thought and history as an awesome and mighty, but also destructive and tragic technique for wielding power. It relates everything to the self, putting the self and its own self-preservation and self-aggrandizement always first. Self-reflection is not just an epistemological posture or habitus, but also a form of relating to others within the world, yet always only through and as a means first and finally of relating to oneself. The brutally cold and relentlessly calculating mentality of bourgeois culture, as analyzed by Marx and Engels, subjects love and desire and everything else to the individual subject in its all-devouring egotism. The alarming consequences become evident in the fully unleashed global capitalism of colonialist and consumerist societies. One would want to reject self-reflection wholesale after witnessing the ravages it brings about in our contemporary world. The accusations brought against it in the tribunals of moral conscience concerning human rights and of consciousness of its environmental impact are staggering. There is, however, also another way of understanding self-reflection, one that Dante can help us to discern. In this alternative optics, self-reflection is not an attempt to recreate or refound the universe with the self at its center, as the origin and end of itself and of the world. Instead, reflection is and knows itself as a response to an other. At least for human subjects, self-reflection in this outlook is not the establishing of the whole universe on the single postulate of the isolated self-grounding and self-founding I, or cogito. The structure of self-reflexivity, in this alternative way of appropriating it, places us rather into relation with a whole universe that is there before us and without us, though not as articulable in discourse. For Dante and his culture, reflection places us in the bosom of God as participants and as reflexes within the divine self-reflection of the Trinity. This other understanding and practice of self-reflection is something that we stand in dire need of recuperating in our self-alienated age. It is possible for self-reflection to be not an assertion of the autonomous power of the individual, but rather a way of discovering the ground of oneself beyond one's own powers in the relations that bind us to others and to the conjecturable ground of all things in their togetherness, which we can only imagine. To this end, certain theological and poetic imaginations of self-reflexivity, which are of great sublimity, call to be revived and saved from the cultural politics condemning a whole civilization for the crimes and deviations perpetrated by its betrayals and failures. We need to understand anew the place of self-reflection in the constitution of ourselves as human beings and of our civil societies and cultural and natural worlds. Self-reflection could and should be an inexhaustible and indispensable resource for contemporary identity politics, as much as for the millenary Western civilization that those politics so relentlessly contest in our academies today. Self-reflection, as the principal motor of our progress and as exploited for the distinctive achievements of modernity, can be a way of ignoring nature and paying attention only to our own artificial constructions. This has become the case today on an unprecedented scale. But self-reflection can also be a way through which we relate to others, including nature, as unknown. For self-relation to be this, we have to leave our systematic knowledge always open at its base and at its outer or upper limits to what we do not know. Only this leveraging from the unknown vitalizes everything that is known, preventing our knowledge from turning into a spectrous, dead, mechanical system cut off in sterile autonomy. Our relations which, to the extent that we comprehend them, are species of self-relation, must become relations to what we do not comprehend, but must rather seek to relate to and acknowledge as beyond the scope of our conceptual powers. The intricate detail of natural phenomena can be charted and analyzed, but where that vital force comes from and the fact that it is at all remain metaphysical mysteries to be contemplated. They cannot be coerced by any formula. A knowing that reflects on itself completely and not just within the parameters of some specific project of deliberate manipulation has to recognize its limits and open itself beyond itself to the infinite mystery of all that is. It must recognize the inexplicable fact that there is anything at all, something rather than nothing, to evoke Leibniz's famous formulation of the metaphysical question. Following this path, self-reflection has to reflect self-critically so as to break out of its own self-enclosed circuits. Thus, self-reflection points in some very different, even opposed directions on the train of our cultural heritage. Self-reflection can be a homogenizing mechanism that turns everything into the same, or it can be the means of opening This is the hemorrhaging, opening the self toward radical otherness. In one case, self-reflection creates a structure, essentially a code, with an internal coherence that enables mastery and manipulation of a constructed system. It circumscribes and defines the real in terms of its own. One's self-referential system can generate a world all its own that need not even admit the existence of others, except as mere material. It's grist for its mill. In this case, self-reflection is technical and mechanical. This type of self-reflection leads toward and enables the technological applications of science in all their inestimably powerful workings. This is the inadvertent legacy of the late scholastic theologian Duns Scotus. But self-reflection can also lead toward a kind of transhumanization. This is Dante's language. Dante and Scotus are exact contemporaries. 1265, they're both born. And I use them. The one is, Scotus points us toward our scientific dystopia today. Dante is pointing towards a theological utopia, if you want to schematize that way. This is much more the case with self-reflection taken to be a reflection of theological transcendence on the model of Dante's trashumanar, right, from the Paradiso, to transhumanize. This path entails open-ended searching in a psychological existential register of reflection. Such self-reflection opens us to an unfathomable and uncontrollable depth within, rather than empowering us to imprint our own image forcibly on the world through a schematized system that brings it under our control. This latter is the mystical way of self-reflection, along which Narcissus can be redeemed. This is the project of Dante's Paradiso, actually. You have Lo Specchio di Narciso. There is Narcissus is very present in hell. There's a moment in Purgatory where Dante has to face himself. It's in the 30th canto. In the 30th canto of Paradiso, then, you have actually the rose, the celestial, la candida rosa, is mirroring itself, admiring itself as in a hillside, in a lake. So what Dante has done is actually, shown us Narcissus and all of its fatal potential, but redeemed self-reflection for its Trinitarian capabilities. Guardando nel suo figlio con l'amore. This is from the Paradiso, looking at his son with love. You have the Trinity. L'ineffabile, there's the ineffable, and il primo valore. So you do actually have Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. It's the whole canticle is Trinitarian. The canticle being the Paradiso, the lyrical language. Lyrical language is self-reflexive language, basically, right? Language calling attention to itself as language. The very structures, rhyme and rhythm. So that's one of the ways in which I would develop the bases for some of the theses that I'm putting across here. Such self-reflection does not establish itself as the foundation of everything, but rather erases its finite self in opening to a larger reality in which it is itself reflected. Such reflection opens itself to divine self-reflection. But by this latter route, what one learns to know fundamentally is that one does not know. This was the wisdom that set Socrates apart from other humans, according to his own understanding of the Delphic oracle. The knowing of one's own unknowing underlies a tradition of negative theology that stretches from Dionysius to Eriugena and Meister Eckhart, or from Augustine to Bonaventure and Nicholas of Cusa. Cusanus, as the last in this series of pathbreakers, makes such self-reflection programmatic under the title of learned ignorance. He also enacts a self-reflective mystical dialectic of seeing the invisible in De Visione Dei. This genealogy forms one axis along which the mystical potency of self-reflection, counterbalancing its scientific powerfulness, plays out historically. However, the wisdom of ignorance can itself be conceived of as a kind of science. It was so conceived by Giambattista Vico with his Scienza Nuova. Humanities studies as means of self-reflection, as modeled by Vico, are an urgently needed antidote to the self-forgetting that plagues the modern age of representation. The injunction, know thyself, the oracle inscribed on the portico of the temple of Apollo at Delphi, according to Pausanias, and taken by Socrates as the model for his activity of self-questioning, expresses the founding charter of the humanities. For Socrates, it entailed knowing that he knew nothing, and that resonates down through subsequent tradition as enjoining a knowledge of human limits, and particularly of human mortality. Stemming from another main root of this tradition, Ecclesiastes' great paean on time. To everything there's a season, and a time to every purpose under the heaven, also recognizes the capability of mortals to envision their temporal limits and know their own vanity. Vanity of vanities, saith the preacher. The tantalizing phrase, he hath set eternity in their heart, so that no man can find out the work of God from the beginning to the end, registers our negative capability of reflecting on our own ignorance vis-a-vis our origin and destiny. Thinking one's own limit is thinking, at least potentially, also beyond oneself. From these classic touchstones, authentic self-reflection emerges as entailing not a focus on the self as object or end in itself, Kant's moral vocabulary, Zweck an sich, so much as a meditative realization of one's own limits to the end of letting the world beyond them, negatively eternity, come into view. The self, despite its contingency and transience, habitually measures all by itself and focuses everything through its own finite lenses. Only when the resulting distortion is dispelled by self-reflective insight into the relativity and ephemerality of the ego can reality begin to show itself as it is, in its absoluteness. Self-reflection is, to this extent, self-relativization. That's how we actually can make contact with the absolute. Such reflection by the self on itself makes it emerge as no longer the unremarked, invisible filter through which all else is reduced to just a figment of the self. The infinite cannot appear so long as everything is known only as reflected by the finite self. This is why our infatuation with technology as a positive, objective projection of our self-empowerment undermines authentic self-awareness. This is, Marshall McLuhan, I think it's important to realize the ways in which technology is really a narcissistic relation to oneself, right? These telephones now that we're all glued to as we sit face to face with one another. Symptomatic of self-oblivion and blindness to our mortality, such infatuation comes with and from our forgetting of who we are as bodily and mortal beings. Genuine self-reflection takes place instead in and through language before language has devolved into just a tool, a type of machinery for manipulating the objective world. More originally, language is a medium and mediation that enables us to reflect on our being in its fathomless totality, which exceeds objective definition. The same can be said of each of our sense modalities. As William Blake admonished, we are led to believe a lie when we see with, not through, the eye. In the medium of language, as in a mirror, either we can see ourselves merely as objects, or we can see through this reflected image so as to contemplate what is not represented nor even representable. Already in Dante's Purgatorio, the mirrors of Leah and Rachel, designated as specchio and miraglio, respectively, distinguish typologically between objective workaday seeing and contemplative seeing through to the dimension in which all appears infinite. Rachel is the allegory for the contemplative life. Miraglio's derivation from Provençal miral recalls its connection with troubadour poetry, where we can already discern a self-reflective self-transcendence budding through lyrical love. Language thereby enables us to contemplate our temporal destiny to no longer exist as material bodies in this world and to peer negatively beyond this limit. Hamlet's "to be or not to be" is based on the godlike capability given us through such large discourse of looking before and after. Language enables us consciously to reflect on our possibility of not existing, on death, and thereby on a world beyond and without us. It opens the negative dimension of the infinite. Knowing one's own ignorance, or unknowing, is a way of glimpsing something infinite and whole, at least in our perception of it, that is inevitably missed in every articulated knowing of a definable object. For Nicholas of Cusa, as for Franz Rosenzweig, we know God precisely in knowing our insuperable ignorance of God. Awareness of reality as a whole begins for us only with this relatively undeceived form of self-reflective self-knowing. However, when conceptualized and verbalized, even such self-reflective knowing becomes ineluctably closed and reductive. Therefore, linguistic self-reflection must culminate by negating itself. Poets sometimes intuit only the pre-reflective consciousness that only the pre-reflective consciousness of the animal can experience the open without and before language. Rilke, the eighth of the Duineser Elegian. Lack of language and of consciousness of death opens the awareness of animals to God standing before them. Vor sich Gott. Reality to them is unendlich, infinite, and open. Dante employs self-reflexive means in order to approach a pre-reflexive consciousness. While he does so, especially through the figure of the suckling infant, infans, which literally means not endowed with language, infans. The Paradiso also abounds in animal images. They capture the spontaneity and immediate consciousness of the blessed and their beatitude. It's a pre-linguistic consciousness then, that is being figured. Self-reflection in Dante's journey ultimately dissolves itself and opens into immediate consciousness without reflection or difference. It becomes one with God. Self-reflection is thus paradoxically both the impediment to our consciousness of God and its indispensable means. We need it humanly in order to transhumanize. Self-reflection in the Middle Ages was pursued to great speculative heights, particularly by philosophers in the Arabic Aristotelian tradition that saturated Dante's intellectual ambience. They emphasized a positive side of self-reflection as true knowledge and as a way of realizing one's immortality, albeit not necessarily for an individual so much as for universal mind, potential intellect. This approach, too, decisively shapes Dante's philosophical thought in his treatises and perdures as a horizon of his total vision. For Dante, however, consonant with the Bible, true self-knowledge passes finally by way of a descent into hell, entailing a complete deconstruction of ego, self, and death, before it leads upward to resurrection in an individual glorious body and to immortal life and light. Utopia, if ever there was one. Dante takes on board this darker, deeper heritage of self-reflection as a deliberate exercise in dying. Self-reflection is prone to melancholy and death, as Ovid's rendering of the Narcissus myth makes crystal clear. This bitter fate of Narcissus prefigures the nihilistic destination of philosophy and therewith of self-reflection in the Western speculative tradition. Wherever self-reflection is carried out as sufficient unto itself and without rupture, opening it to an outside. However, another possibility is based on employing the imagination of self-reflection animated by blind contact and openness to an unfathomable other that points reflection in quite another direction. Dante manages to encompass and unite both of these tendencies looming at the aurora of modern thought in its multivalent potential. He thereby dramatizes the profound ambiguity of self-reflection. Two modern philosophers, Hegel and Heidegger, distinguish themselves as having continued in the tradition of making reflection on human mortality fundamental to the task of philosophy. Heidegger explicates human existence, or Dasein, being there, as essentially being unto death, sein zum Tod. And Hegel's Absolute is based on reflection on the nullity of our sensuous being as enshrined in the rites of Ceres, right, the goddess of grain. Observed even by the beasts, they are not mesmerized by the things before them, but rather zehren sie auf, they eat them up, as he charmingly puts it in the Phenomenology of Spirit. Only such concrete realization of the finitude of human existence enables it to complete itself as an infinite whole, a completed circuit of self-reflection. The apparently objective reality of things is eaten up by time and is turned by conscious reflection into an open, ongoing event that can be made to reflect on itself in and through language. This reflection, then, is no longer bound by time. Instead, it has a structure complete in itself as self-reflection. Hegel is the modern thinker par excellence, who would bind everything into a comprehensive system by the bond of self-reflection. But he also exposes its limits in the mortal creature. Heidegger stands at the departure point, launching into postmodern thinking, where self-reflection breaks down and becomes obsessed with its insurmountable inability to complete its own terms, to be complete on its own terms alone. Self-reflection shows itself to be but a means of approach to what is not the self, and not reflection either, as we know them. Applying self-reflection to the limit of discovering an absolute that pries reflection open to its other is the feat that we can see Dante's lyrical language performing. I trace this self-reflection forward to its modern realization, eventually in a techno-scientific apocalypse. But we can also discern in Dante the premises of an alternative modernity in which self-reflection points outside itself to relate to an other in a religious dimension, a utopian dimension. In secular modernity, self-reflection becomes merely a means of constructing a self-enclosed sphere of immanence rather than, as for Dante and his tradition, a challenge placing us face to face with unassimilable alterity. Our now post-secular times enable us once again to see this other legacy that was there from the origins of modern thought with Dante. I endeavor to comprehend this alternative in terms of the theological mystery of language by considering later philosophical elaborations of what was first manifest intuitively in Dante's invention of a self-reflexive lyrical language that reflects transcendent divinity in his Paradiso. I alternate philosophical formulations of this dialectic with analyses of its historical instantiations as illuminated by or as radiating from the Paradiso. Our mastering all reality as our resource, so that we see only ourselves and our own needs and purposes reflected everywhere, disenchants the world and produces a dead natural order consisting of matter in motion. This is our modern Enlightenment heritage. However, self-reflection can also be the means by which we gain critical distance on this production as an ersatz world of formal, linguistically defined spectral entities, or non-entities, really. The real is evacuated. By transcendental self-reflection, we can take critical cognizance of our own intellectual process in producing this grid of sterile, dead abstractions. And this shows the path leading back to the mystery of life within us and all around us. Self-reflection is the source of a deadening plague of totalizing rationalization, as well as its remedy. It is the pharmacon, if ever there was one, and in fact, the most indispensable prescription underlying them all. Our speculative heritage of transcendental self-reflection, of recursively reflecting on reflection itself, puts self-reflection in a perspective of critical awareness of human limits that lets reality again emerge in its own integrity as pre-existing all our relativizing and finally totalizing human determinations. Rather than seeing only the same ourselves everywhere we look, we see even in ourselves the unknown and other. Of course, this maneuver too is humanly determined, but in a self-negating and self-transcending mode. Negative theology is a form of reflection par excellence that prepares through radically self-critical self-reflection for encounter with the absolutely other. Dante's Paradiso embodies negative theology in poetic language that richly reveals self-reflection's ability to reflect on itself in such a way as to open up to and reflect this other. A conclusion now. The advance of our technological revelation eclipses the dimension of otherness by encompassing all in its uniform system. Digitalization reduces all to known sequences of 0 and 1, repeated robotically. However, there's also an arguably positive side to technology. Technological miracles, the collapsing of time and space, enabling our conscious awareness to transcend tremendous geographical distances, as well as make long past times present again, can be understood as fulfilling the dreams of religion or the promises of prophecy, as a virtual spiritual life or consciousness that knows no limits in time and space. Technology has made being everywhere at once possible. We can see into the streets of Beijing or Tehran day and night. We can peer transhistorically into the past and into simulations of the future. Overcoming the natural limits of consciousness in time and space, technology seems able to realize kingdom come. Religion, since time immemorial, binds or ties us together. Networks are doing this today. Information networks are like powerful religions. Prima facie, technology and affairs of the spirit seem to be polar opposites. However, historical perspective will surely alter our views. Religion moved in essential ways into the aesthetic realm in the 19th century, as Matthew Arnold observed and Terry Eagleton underscores. Today, religio, in the sense of tying everything together and back to its source, is being achieved by technological means. Hans-Georg Gadamer critiques the aestheticization characteristic of modern historicist culture because of its reduction of the truth of art to subjective perception and emotion. In part 1 of Wahrheit und Methode, Gadamer objects particularly to the subjectivizing of aesthetics by Kant. The problem with technology is it's reducing everything to the measure of man and his supposed self-reflexive mastery of all. Surely, the dissolving of religion into information today merits an analogous critique. The danger of technology, as in framing for Heidegger, Gestell, is that it conceals from humans the origin of the revealment or disclosure that is truth. Creativity, notably in art, particularly poetry, is covered over by technology that reduces all beings to mere material resources for human exploitation. Now, Bestand, standing reserve. In Heidegger's words, the rule of enframing threatens man with the possibility that it could be denied to him to enter into a more original revealing and hence to experience the call of a more primal truth. Almost all discussions concerning technology at our present historical juncture, suddenly obsessed with AI, are about how to contain it and make it serve human ends, rather than spin out of control into a position where it can dominate us. But this approach is symptomatic of failing to think the essence of technology. We see in it only an instrument to be controlled. We place ourselves in the sovereign position of working our will on the world with our instruments and consider AI technology a potential threat to this order of things. Indeed, the current development of AI directly challenges this anthropocentric order of command. The challenge of Heidegger would be to let ourselves be part of a destiny that exceeds us and decenters us. This is conformable to the ethos and calling of the humanities. Not to dominate, but to transform ourselves in the image of the granting of destiny, yet without disowning our total responsibility for our own actions. Heidegger's errancies with National Socialism would stand, for many, as a dire warning of the danger in surrender to any idea of historical destiny. Today we have Make America Great Again as a call to destiny, entailing release from control by rules and regulations. The European opposition, by privileging the calculable that claims to stabilize relations, risks instead sacrificing the benefits of creative chaos and encloses us in a machine of our own making without grace. By insisting on human control, the European response to the American challenge is perhaps unduly limiting in its unwillingness to face the danger from which comes the saving gift. Wo aber Gefahr ist, wächst das Rettende auch, right? Where danger is, grows the saving, literally, right? Das Rettende. European leaders generally advocate for a regulated world. This can be positive, but not as a means of attempting to control everything. Control of ourselves and our limited sphere of action, self-reflectively, had best aim at releasing being, or our shared reality, into a greater freedom which we do not direct, an openness of unlimited relationality to which we can only respond. I hope we will respond by affirming and fostering it. Thanks. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I'm tempted to go on, but no, your turn.
Thank you, William, very much. So we have still 10 minutes for the discussion. I open the discussion now. Are there any questions, comments? Please raise your hands. Please.
Yeah, two questions. Very, very interesting talk. So much depth, and I cannot address everything, of course, in two questions. But two questions I have is about the theme of today, apocalypse. So you're talking about technological apocalypse, and my question to you is, what is your conception of apocalypse there? Because it seems to me a metaphorical understanding of apocalypse in the sense of a negative tendency to ignore otherness, not being open, and so forth. But also you were referring to the existential threat of technology. So I would like to invite you to elaborate on that. And the second, more critical question is, you seem to offer a tempting dichotomy between an instrumentalist approach to being, to existence, fueled by technology, and what I would say a more mystical approach, open to the real, something that cannot be said, cannot be controlled. And my question, perhaps a bit too naive question, what exactly is the real? And can we move beyond our construction? So there is also a dichotomy in your thinking about between linguistic constructions and what is absolutely there, the absolute.
Right.
Can we transcend our constructions?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah, I'm tempted. We cannot, and we have to. You know, really, we're faced with that impossibility, and that is the challenge to us. And you know, the question is sort of right on the mark, and it remains the question. And you know, we have to really live in that open questioning without being able. I think, as soon as we answer it, we fall to the instrumental side, and that's really the only way that we can proceed concretely. But we have to remain open to, you know, what I was calling this mystical side. And so it really is a matter of breaking down the dichotomy, which you correctly underlined. You know, I use that dichotomy in order really to try to undermine it. And you know, concerning apocalypse, apokalypson, you know, out of hiding or away from hiddenness in the Greek root. You know, what's metaphorical? Is there any alternative to metaphorical ways of thinking about apocalypse? Heidegger would not. He doesn't use that vocabulary because, you know, he's skeptical about religion, although his roots are very much in religion. You know, Entbergen, Entschlossenheit. These are his terms, and they, you know, they mean apocalypse, really, literally. I would say, you know, to come out in the literal Greek sense, coming out of hiding, out of closedness. You know, aletheia is his word really for apocalypse. So I don't know whether, you know, if you want to put it in another framework of, you know, maybe the Bible and apocalypse, which is a wonderful, inexhaustible framework within which to think of it. It's true, I was approaching here really rather from a philosophical Heideggerian perspective, and that leaves a whole other conceptuality of apocalypse as open territory still to be addressed. And I do mean for it to be addressed, and that's why I cited Ecclesiastes in parallel with the more secular traditions. Yeah.
Ian, please.
Yes. The Canadian philosopher George Grant once described technology as the theology of liberalism. And it strikes me that you put a lot of weight on self-reflectivity. And in the light of what we might call, grossly simplifying, the modern mind, the idea of the self has to begin with, where is that self situated? And for Dante, for the old traditions, we were in a cosmos, the first sort of proposition in natural law theory. We're in a cosmos in which there's teleology, everything's ordered towards an end. In the modern conception, we don't start necessarily with cosmos at all, and there's a great skepticism about teleology. So self-reflectivity in relation to AI or utopia or apocalypse is utterly different depending on whether one is in a world in which humility is an aspect of the self, and in loving engagement, which is this idea of spondeo, which is the core of our word respond, which is to pledge or commit. To what? What are we pledging and committing to? It seems to me in the old idea where grace is perfecting nature, the cosmos is infilled with this kind of sacramentality. Whereas in the modern mind, epitomized, and Heidegger makes this point in his essay on humanism, with a sense of values that emerge from the self in a kenotic manner in which our imprint is the primary thing of the will, rather than an engagement with the other in the Dante cosmological sense. So I'd like your comment on this, because how do we bridge this gap of this radical different starting point with the cosmological and the non-cosmological conception?
Yeah. Well, I would say by the imagination. And, rather than positing that, for Dante, it was just like he imagines it. The same as we can do today. Obviously, the history separates us, but it also unites us. Rather than positing sort of two incommunicable historical eras, pre and post modernity. One of the exciting things about our postmodern thinkers is the way in which we've been able to recuperate so many of the, the approaches of pre-modern thought. So it seems to me that in any age, utopia is a matter of the imagination, and the cosmos is a matter of imagination as well. Rather than positing it as simply a fact, this was the world in which Dante lived, we no longer live in that world, and so we cannot imagine anything comparable. Of course, that's just to affirm the possibility of communicating across historical distances and recuperating something. Now, we do want to focus very much on the specificity of our times, the difference that makes. Absolutely. Dante's already doing that in turning the corner from ancient medieval tradition and opening a perspective of the subject, really, in what we consider pre-modern times. But there is this, even St. Augustine, of course, gives us a kind of subjectivity, but it's still a universal, exemplary subjectivity, rather than insisting on the idiosyncrasy of his own, like Rousseau in his Confessions would make the the unique self so much more important. But you're right that we enter into a realm of values, as you put it, in the values projected from the subject. Dante's already using il primo ineffabile valore is a name of God, actually. The first and ineffable value. Dante calls him that. Even for God did not really exist more objectively in the Middle Ages. God was what was imagined, and the reality was always mediated through the imagination. So I'm trying to launch a challenge to our imaginations, really, to not be so focused on are gadgets, which are miraculous, really, but they're not more miraculous than the inventions of the human spirit in the freedom of the imagination that we have in the Bible and in classical literature that we were talking about, and all the way through our tradition to modern poets.
Actually, I have two follow-up questions. Regarding what Ian said. So my first question is self-reflection possible without the idea of the truth and reference to transcendence? Because when you were talking about the origins of self-reflections, you mentioned that it was important to be true to yourself and true to God. And now, when we talk about transhumanism and identity politics, which you mentioned, there is this idea that there is no... so when we refer to transcendence, we have some boundaries which are set to our self-creation. We discover ourselves. And when we talk about transhumanism and identity politics, the approach is very different. So there is no point of reference. Actually, everything is self-creation. There is no nature, given nature, but nature is self-created. And there are no boundaries which are given to this self-creation. So this is something very, very different. And so my question is self-reflection possible with the idea of the metaphysical truth and the point of reference? This is question number one. And question two, also regarding what Ian was saying. So I think that this modern technological civilization and modern mindset is based on this shift, cosmological shift of paradigm. So the idea of cosmos, the idea of order, harmony, was replaced by nature, which is considered as chaos, as something from which we have to emancipate ourselves. And for instance, Francis Bacon, in his Utopia New Atlantis, perfectly grasped this idea. And he claimed that we have to use technology and science to control nature and to emancipate ourselves from nature. And it resulted in our alienation and created all the problems that we are facing now. So is it possible to use self-reflection to come back to the idea that we are not alienated, but we are a part of nature? And how to overcome this alienation today?
I do think that self-reflection has to be the way back, as well as what brought us into this state of alienation. And we have to use technology. I don't reject the Baconian project of emancipating oneself, but it's not the final goal, actually. There are ways in which one emancipates oneself within a context that is never mastered and that we can't even define, but that we have to relate to. And we're erasing that other because we only perceive what is defined in our concepts. And the reality of everything is infinite, but we're only dealing with finite entities. And, just, for example, we polarize into national identities as if we're enemies because of being, European or Russian or whatever it is. Those are falsifications, really, of the infinite humanity that is in every one of us, and that needs to relate together. Now, there were really some deep reaching interrogations in what you brought up. I mean, you say, is self-reflection possible without, this was the first point, a relation to transcendence? And I do think that the erasure of transcendence is a big problem. On the other hand, transcendence cannot be grasped, and you can't really hang on to it. So by its nature, it's going to be erased. This is the dialectic, for Heidegger, this is you know, the concealing of unconcealing, being unconcealed, it really, there's nothing that you can grasp onto, define, and say, all right, this is the truth, right? I think that's where you really started, a relation to the truth, which is, it's an open relation, you know, of searching for, you know, truth to God and to self. It requires us, I think, to bond together with one another, with all others, and without exclusions, without saying, you know, we can't listen to that camp. They are really outside the pale. You have to try and understand why they, to the extent that they, you know, they sincerely believe their approach. Whatever you define the truth to be, whatever any group defines the truth to be, is not it. The truth is that other that needs to be searched out together with them and their opponents. You know, I think we have to, you know, we can call that the transcendence of truth, if you like. Again, you know, the vocabulary of transcendence can be released as well. There, you know, a thinker like Deleuze, and he's building on Spinoza, immanence. You know, Hegel was a thinker of immanence as well. If you think immanence all the way through, it too, it transcends. It transcends the grid of concepts. It becomes you know, une vie, l'immanence une vie. This is Gilles Deleuze, his actual final testament. Immanence itself becomes infinite life, and you know, what is transcendence if not that? This is the self-negating technique of I was going to say apophatic thinking, but I just mean thinking in its inherent apophatic character that, you know, we can try to bring out. There's a lot more. We'll take that up. You know, so, yeah.
Thank you very much. Any more comments, questions?
Do we have time for one more?
Yes, sure, Matthew, please.
Just very briefly question. Professor, thank you very much for a very inspiring lecture. I just have one very quick question about the threat that the technological self-reflection will eliminate deeply human self-reflection, because I believe that you have highlighted that in your presentation, that there is a certain threat that this technological process will not only overlap, but it will consume the deeply human process, that we can find the intuitions of that process in Dante's Paradise. Yeah? And my question actually is based on this observation by Hans-Georg Gadamer, and this is the lesson that he's taken from the old masters, I believe mostly from Aristotle, that in this process of being human, we need to use at least two different types of knowledge. Not only techne, but also phronesis. Is it possible that one day techne will consume phronesis? Because that would be the real case of apocalypse, understood as a final end of something. Because you had a very, for me, inspiring observation that, for example, now in the face of the international crisis, the leaders of European Union want to regulate the future. Is it even possible to make a total regulation of anything if we know that we constantly need to repeat our self-reflection process by using phronesis? And this is an open process. Only techne can be iteration, and you mentioned that this self-repeating one-to-one, one-to-one. But this is something that can be only in the case of AI, but human epistemological being or epistemological design, forgive me for using this notion from Heidegger, probably I don't know what I'm talking about here, but is it possible that techne will ever consume phronesis or make it unnecessary in our human world, in our human condition?
Right. Well, you know, it threatens to do that, and you know, if phronesis, I think, is the necessary antidote, kind of practical intelligence that is not calculable in formalized algorithms. Right? That cannot be rendered technological. And no, you put your finger really on, an area of a kind of intelligence which is, I don't know, which resists being artificial intelligence, right? It's, now, it is astonishing the way in which artificial intelligence develops. I really don't see that we can hold up a strict dichotomy between, the human and the artificial. And we are facing this threat. And as I say, I don't really want to think of it in oppositional terms, like, we have to overcome this and keep it within control. We have to be true to ourselves and true to the ground of ourselves. And, theology speaks of God, certainly our connectedness to one another. And I refuse to make a war. And, that really is the specter before us, a war with artificial intelligence. But let's keep our phronesis, our practical intelligence alive. Cultivating humanities studies, I think, is a crucial component to integrating these new technological capacities, responding to them. And I hope that we can avoid making a war out of it. Even though, Blake says without contraries, there is no progress. So, there are times and places where, some kind of conflict and war has to occur, but always with a view to finding out what is actually the common ground. After beyond the dispute, we all have interests that are greater than the ones that we are disputing over. Shared common grounds.
Okay, I think we are running late. So once again, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, good. Thanks. It's a pleasure.